Welcome everybody to this event kickstarting the European Biotech Week 2023. My name is Claire Scantleberry and I'm delighted to join you today from EuropaBio, where we will be looking at the economic impact of biotechnology globally, but also with a particular focus on Europe. So I'm going to welcome you to the meeting with a few pieces of housekeeping. We are recording the webinar, if that is okay with everybody here. And what we will do for all the registered participants as well, we will share the slides and the recording of the webinar afterwards. So we are going to run through our webinar today. So what are we talking about? I'm going to give you a short introduction into European Biotechnology Week and look at, from a EuropaBio perspective, understanding what biotechnology really is and what it looks like when it's translated into products and processes. Really looking at the heart of what biotech looks like in terms of economic impact, because it features in lots of different ways. We're going to talk about how we understand its role for Europe's future industrial growth, because it's already a very active part of Europe's economic engine, and this is getting more significant day by day. And from me particularly, you will have an introduction to biotechnology and how it sits within the big picture within Europe and the world. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Dennis Ostwald from the WifOR Institute, who is going to present his report on the economic performance of biotechnology. And that should give us a really interesting insight into how we can actually measure what is often a technology driving products and processes rather than being described as the product itself. You are absolutely encouraged to drop questions and comments into the discussion, the Q&A, because we will have, after my short introduction and Dennis's presentation, we will have a Q&A session, because there's always a lot to talk about in terms of biotechnology and what it looks like from an economic perspective. So we really welcome everybody here. So I will kickstart by talking about what is European Biotechnology Week. This is something that's been running for, I think, 12 or 13 years now, and it's actually part of a global initiative. And what we really want to do when we talk about this is help inform people about what biotechnology is, how it impacts their lives, and to celebrate it, because it really makes a very big difference in a lot of the things that we do, and often in quite surprising places. EuropaBio, as the industry association for biotechnology in Europe, is very proud to be a host within Europe, and we work with our global partners where each different bit of the world is running a different type of biotechnology week. You can get involved in more Biotech Week activities by visiting our website and looking at which activities are local to you. Alternatively, contact your local biotechnology association, and they should be running activities during this week as well. So I hope you really enjoy this insight into biotechnology from the EuropaBio perspective. And again, don't forget to ask any questions or make any comments in the chat. So I'm going to start off with a really quick insight into EuropaBio. Who are we and what do we do? So we are, as I mentioned, the industry association for biotechnology in Europe. And we have the overall mission to help create a really strong framework in which Europe's brilliant R&D and innovation can be translated into products and processes that both benefit us as citizens from being able to use them, and also help deliver company development, economic growth, skills development, because it's a very broad technology applied into a lot of different sectors. So how do we do this? What is at the heart of our work? You will see from the slide here that we support lots of different aspects of biotechnology. So you always start with the science, and Europe has brilliant science. We help our members deliver excellent science, both into the public and the private domain, because both parts of researchers are incredibly important for enabling biotechnology to become products and processes. We do a lot of work in the regulatory area, because what biotechnology and indeed all advanced technologies need is a stable and robust regulatory framework that allows companies and innovators to develop a product strongly through to its end application. We work a lot also on accessibility, because you can't have and benefit from a product unless you can actually access it. So we work on how citizens and how countries are able to gain access to biotechnology products. I've already mentioned it here, but growth is another really important part of our work. We look at how biotechnology has a huge economic impact and also how it helps build Europe's fabric, because there are clusters and regions all across Europe that have a huge footprint from biotechnology across lots of different sectors. And so a lot of regions in Europe have very high employment levels through biotechnology applications into industry. When we're talking also about clusters and regions, we also talk about infrastructure. This is about how you build the right ecosystem, including specialized buildings, specialized logistics between regions, to help develop biotechnology to enable it to be delivered. And a lot of investment on both public and private sides goes into this. And of course, competitiveness. This is a global activity. So what we try to push for Europe is to ensure that it's always at the forefront of a technology. And Europe has such a deep, long track record in excellent research that we want to help that be translated into products and processes that are based on R&D that is funded inside Europe. And that allows Europe to be more competitive, and it allows it to be very sustainable and resilient as well. So how do we do that within EuropaBio? We have three main engines of advocacy that we use. We have our Healthcare Biotechnology Council, we have an Industrial Biotech Council, and we have our National Associations Council. And between them, they cover the key aspects of biotechnology that we know need to be addressed in order for it to be delivered to a product, delivered to citizens, delivered to consumers, and enabling Europe to be competitive. And we do that in lots of different ways. We have lots of voices that address biotechnology. We engage directly with policymakers at regional, national, European, and indeed global levels to make sure that policies are being developed really strongly and that regulatory frameworks are coherent and allow companies to develop. We also have very special voices for each type of stakeholder. We work a lot with small companies, because these guys are the real vehicle for innovation in Europe and indeed globally. Once you have amazing academic research, it will develop further into application through small companies, and they are a vital part of the ecosystem everywhere. We also talk about patients when we're looking at healthcare, because they are incredibly important, because of course we are all patients at some time in our lives, and the role of the patient and the voice of the patient is very important in ensuring that the right technologies are developed in the right way. We talk about biomanufacturing as well through our biomanufacturing platform within EuropaBio, because this is a great way of explaining and using accessible language to say how biotechnology turns into a product, because you will be really surprised at what falls into the category of biomanufacturing. And you will see as well, we have European Biotech Week, which you are here with us now. So we do a lot of talking to a lot of different people to ensure that different communities that are part of making biotech happen as products and processes, that they are talking to each other, that they create a smooth or coherent path for technologies to be developed. I could talk about this all day on this one single slide, but I will stop. And we're really driven by our members. So we work with companies and organizations from across the biotechnology spectrum. From our corporate membership side, we work with companies that develop their own products. So these are guys that are producing products or selling their own products. And this is at the very heart of biotechnology innovation in Europe. And you will see there's companies right from the smallest startup through to large international organizations. We also have a very strong community of national associations as well, because these are the organizations that represent biotechnology at either national or regional level, and they are key to ensuring the right investment into infrastructure, the right skills, the right national policies through which biotechnology can be delivered. And you'll see it's a really broad audience. Indeed, there is no area of Europe, no region of Europe that does not have biotechnology as part of its smart specialization strategy. So it's very important for everybody. So I wanted to take a step back and go back and say, okay, how does biotechnology work? And for that, I've gone back to our definition of biomanufacturing, because this shows you what biotechnology is in action. So it's making use of biological mechanisms and components for a number of different ways. You can either directly use them as products, they can act as tools or vehicles, or they can be processes. And it all takes place at a scale at which it can be used for industrial applications. So that might be quite small scale for specialized health use, but it might be very large scale when it comes to manufacturing, say, new food products or energy. And there are lots of different sources that you can use for biotechnology. A lot is undertaken within animal and human cells, and this is where you will see a lot of healthcare work is derived around human cells, particularly as you get to more advanced healthcare innovations coming out. Plants are used a lot, either the whole plant themselves or as individual plant cells. You can engineer these to do a lot of different things. And one of our key points in EuropaBio addresses microorganisms, because these are used increasingly with industrial biotechnology to manufacture different components that we wish to use. And finally, you have viruses. They're very much involved in biomanufacturing as well, because they are amazing vehicles to carry genetic information into different cells. And they are used a lot across different applications of biotechnology. So as I've already mentioned, biotechnology and biomanufacturing can either use biological processes to synthesize the desired product, or they can be the product itself. And two great examples to use are where the biomanufacturing and the biology is the product itself. It's looking at immunotherapy, which is increasingly used in treating cancer, where you will use the patient's own immune system to target diseases. And this is where a significant number of new healthcare technologies are becoming available to patients. Another example of biotechnology applied into biomanufacturing is used in food production. We're all familiar with alternative protein production and the different types of non-meat products that are coming into the market, or indeed lab-based meat. But you can synthesize a lot of ingredients that we already take for granted on a day-to-day basis through reprogramming microorganisms. And we've got really amazing companies that can produce dairy proteins, for example, to show that you can produce the same product as a traditional process, but you can produce it through a microorganism instead, which has a huge implication for carbon footprint, sustainability, your ability to manufacture locally. These are all changed significantly when you can bring biotechnology into manufacturing processes. And this is not unique to Europe. This is really this is a global industrial transformation right now. We've been through many decades of manufacturing through petrochemicals, using fossil fuels. Now the whole world is starting to look at how it can manufacture and use biotechnology for much more sustainable products and processes, but also, as I've already mentioned, in advancing healthcare significantly. So this is not something that's just new and on the scene. This is a global transition that is taking place right now. And a really wonderful example of this is if you stretch back to 2020, where the Nobel Prize for Chemistry was awarded to CRISPR, which you may have heard of as a method of genome editing. And so we will share with you the links that you can find out a little bit more after this, but it shows you that the advance in genetic engineering and genome editing through technology such as CRISPR means that we can undertake incredibly precise changes to, or adaptations to, genomes that we can then precisely use for what we wish them to. It's an incredible technology that has come to maturation, and it's being applied into lots and lots of different sectors, right through from healthcare through to, as we've already mentioned, things like manufacturing of novel food products using alternative methods. So we will share this with you at the end of the webinar so that you can read a little bit more yourself. But this is really showing how biotechnology has come of age in terms of its ability to help us drive our own development and our own industrial growth. And this, it very much is recognized now in lots of different places around the world. This is not a European initiative. This is a global initiative. Some of you may have listened to the State of the Union address 2 weeks ago from Ursula von der Leyen, and EU biotech and biomanufacturing was specifically brought into focus to set up a new initiative to ensure that we make the best use of the advanced research that Europe itself has derived in many places. But we're not alone in this. The US has published an executive order to advance biotech and biomanufacturing. There are other policies and strategies globally in large manufacturing ecosystems. So we're talking about India, China, Japan. The whole world is making this transition into a more biotech-driven approach to industry. And when you look at this from an advancing industrial perspective, when you take on advanced technologies such as biotechnology, you improve your competitiveness because you are moving into a space as a leader. And when you improve your competitiveness, you are going to increase employment, you are going to increase the resilience of your economies to be able to manufacture, to respond, to have enough depth in them to respond to issues such as the COVID pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of these things require countries and economies to be robust, and using advanced technologies allows you to do this. So turning towards Dennis and what he's going to explain with you today, it's often very difficult to capture exactly what biotechnology, how you measure it, because it's always been described as an enabling technology. So often you don't see it in the product or the process that you may be using. And you may see it, in the materials that you use from a day-to-day basis. You'll see more come from biological origins. And I would use household detergents are a great example of this. But often it's behind the scenes. So we worked with the WifOR Institute, which is an independent research institute, to look at how we can pin down what economic activity is linked to biotechnology. Because it's not the same as saying all of healthcare or all of energy production. Those are sectors. They are not the technology behind it. So we worked with WifOR to identify the correct indicators that can be used to measure biotechnology. And we initially did this, we did a 10-year review from 2008 to 2018, which was published sort of just in the middle of COVID. And we're really happy to launch to you today the update of this, where we went back and looked at those indicators again for a 2021 update. And the original story that it told us from our first 10-year review was that biotechnology plays a very big role in EU's trade surplus. You can see here, those were the numbers back in 2018 with a 22 billion euro trade surplus. It was a highly productive industry with a very high level of gross value added per employee. And we will see a little bit more of that in the presentation today. And finally, it was growing at a rate far beyond that of the average EU rate. So we clocked in at 4.1% by the time we got to 2018, and we're expecting that to continue to grow. So I will hand over to Dennis now, because Dennis is really going to be able to explain why it's important to measure biotechnology and how we can translate this into economic figures that we recognize. So I will stop sharing so that Dennis can switch his slides on, and we're really looking forward to an in-depth dive into what biotechnology does from an economic perspective. So Dennis, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claire. I hope you can see my screen. Perfect. Thank you for the warm welcome and having me here. Within the next 20 minutes, I want to give you some insights about the updated study results. And thank you, Claire and EuropaBio, for the trust that we can now continue our collaboration on this really important topic. I structured my presentation as follows. The reason is, within our study, we analyzed all the different subsectors of biotechnology and biomanufacturing. So means agriculture biotech, industry biotech, and healthcare biotech. We all know that the healthcare part is still one of the biggest out of these subsectors. So I want to focus a little bit more why we do this calculation also in terms as health as an investment. And we are working as WifOR since decades, or since 15 years on this topic, to foster a paradigm shift that health isn't a cost factor, but an investment. And I will explain why this study can support political decision makers in doing the right things. Then I will dig deeper into the direct effects of the biotech production in Europe, some facts and figures. And then I will explain the economic footprint for the biotech production in Europe. And by the way, that's a suggestion, what we did together with Harvard University within a policy paper for G20. There, within this policy paper, I will come back to it a little bit later, we recommended to governments to measure not only the direct effects of biotech or health economy, but also the indirect induced effects of the economic footprint. And I'm really happy that we have this data at hand so that you can use it. And I will have some conclusions in the end. About WifOR, so we are really happy that we grew with our customers in the last years and internationalized our research. True is that we are dealing in some niches, and so it's really important for us that we provide more and more governments in the world with such important data. And we have different locations in different countries and an international team. And we were founded in 2019, so next year we will celebrate our 15th birthday. Health as investment, as I mentioned before, and it's really shocking, in my opinion, we still think about COVID, and there are some COVID waves on the way now. And we have seen during the COVID pandemic, I got the feeling that healthcare was, or the entire healthcare system was seen as a supporter and stakeholders who help us to stay healthy, to get rid of this crisis. And there was investment during this time in innovation, in product, process, and system innovation. But now it turns, after a multiple crisis, it seems to be that governments start again to see health investment as a cost factor again. They need to manage their budgets. And especially in these times, we need to provide evidence that we should put investments in health, investments in biotech on the top agenda of the political decision makers. We need to point out that investments create growth, wealth, innovation, and last but not least, better health. Also, agriculture biotech or industrial biotech, it's a supply chain which creates, in the end, better health. Here's the paper, what I mentioned. It was first launched at the G20 presidency of Italy. It now circulates in India, and we will add an additional layer to it when we will publish it at the G20 presidency in Brazil next year. And it's also circulating at the G7 round, and I presented it at the UNGA and some other events. And what do we suggest in this paper? And that's what we are doing now in this study as well. First of all, you need to measure the economic footprint of a sector. Here, the health economy. Part of the health economy is the healthcare biotech. Then you need to think about supply chains. We need to break silos. We need to find out the interlinkages. How can healthcare biotech support in a value chain of healthcare to make the processes even more efficient? And then as a third layer, we suggest to measure the entire economic footprint, including the spillover effects. And we did this exercise within this study on behalf of EuropaBio. What's the additional aspect for the G20 presidency in Brazil? We need to connect the dots also not only in economic terms of investments, but also to environmental impacts. So what does it mean if we invest 1 billion in biotech? What does it mean for CO2 emissions, for water consumption? How can we benchmark it? How can we find arguments that it's smart also in topics of climate change to invest in different subsectors of the health economy? And the last aspect is, yes, so what? If we are investing in healthcare, biotech, or in health economy, what in the end does it mean for the patients, for the society, and in the end, for the parliamentarians, for the voters, right? So we need to position it's smart investment in health economy, in healthcare biotech, that this creates a social impact. And I'm really honored and happy that I was invited to the European Parliament this summer. And they asked Rifat and myself if we have ideas how to embed a certain health metrics into the EU semester. And we presented it also in Geneva at the H20 summit. Mr. Tedros was aware, was virtually connected, and he is aware of all these ideas. And the ideas are very simple. If we think about health investments, then we need to think about a return on investment. If we talk about a return investment, we need to measure it and define different categories of return. And the first aspect, I start from the right side, is the economic impact of investments. So we can see what does it mean, what is the GVA contribution to private and public investments in health economy, in healthcare, biotech. And this is the first return on investment. The second one is we need to measure, as we suggest in the G20 paper, that we need to measure what is the social impact. And we describe the social impact as an impact on human capital, on paid and unpaid human capital. Why is it so important? In Europe and some countries, we are facing a high labor market shortage. We need also to think not only in health, better health categories, but we need also to think about how can we keep our societies healthy to be productive, not only in terms of paid activities, but also in voluntary work. Think about informal care, think about taking care of kids, and so on. So we need a healthy society to keep our wealth, to keep our productivity, and to keep our youth together. Last but not least, we should consider smart investments and allocation of budgets. We should allocate budgets according to the cost of illnesses in societies. So if we are facing a huge cardiovascular burden, by the way, for Europe, it's around it's equivalent to 4 to 5% of our GDP. Then we need to allocate budget there, and we need to find a lot of stakeholders along the value chain of healthcare to tackle these issues. And I presented at the European Parliament, if we want to set a target, why shouldn't we set a target that we want to reduce the social burden of cardiovascular diseases or oncology up to 2030 by XYZ%? And if you trust physicians, cardiovascular diseases 80% of them are preventable. If we are not as ambitious and we only want to prevent 40% of it up to 2030, actually we can save up 2%, around 2% points of our wealth in the EU. But now coming to the study results. First of all, we see due to COVID a certain stagnation in 2021. So due to COVID, there was not as the success story of the last years. But we can still see in the compound average growth rates that the total biotech is 3.2%, driven by the average growth of 3.1% of healthcare biotech. We see that industrial and agriculture biotech, they're accelerating in the last years. So we have around 1% point higher growth contribution to biotech compared to the total economy. And we now really see there is in some countries kind of a recession in Europe, and we still see that there is a positive contribution from biotech in Europe. So it's a stabilizer of the European economy. Since 2008, more than 50,000 jobs were additionally created. So around 225,000 people are employed, most of them in the healthcare biotech, but you can see the growing numbers in the industrial biotech and also in the agriculture biotech. Here you can see on this slide, because if you talk about characterizing biotech and numbers, we heard in the last couple of years so many numbers that sometimes you don't have a feeling how much is it, billions, trillions. So we like always to compare it, and this is based on our methodological approach that we are working with data from Eurostat and from statistical authorities, that we can point out that the GVA of the biotech industry accounts for 1/4 of the pharma's direct effect to European GDP. You can compare it to automotive industry and mechanical engineering, chemicals. We see that biotech is not as big as automotive and mechanical engineering, but what we can see here now, and that was the result also out of the first study, we have a very, very, very productive sector, right? So with a share of 0.1%, we are creating 0.23% of their biotech share. We'll come back to this on this slide. Here you can see that the healthcare biotech is now around 174,000 euro per full-time equivalent. Total biotech is 153, and you can compare it to manufacturing and others. So we see here a very innovative and very productive sector within the EU, a real outperformer. Why is the sector so innovative, and why is it so productive? We see that there are a lot of investments in R&D, right? We are investing more and more in R&D, so 3 billion in 2021, and this is an average compound average growth rate from 4.1, and the healthcare biotech has 4.2% points, 4.2%. So we see that biotech is growing, but it's sustainable growing, because it's not only growing in terms of GDA contribution, but also in way of R&D investments in R&D activities in Europe. And now maybe one aspect to industrial biotech, it accounts at 17% for a far higher share of the positive trade balance in biotechnology than ever before, right? So we see that industrial biotech is a driver of exports. And we need to think about it and take it serious, that there seems to be high opportunities in exports of industrial biotech products. And that is a signal, or if you analyze it, it's an indicator for high competitiveness globally. But now coming back to the layer 3 in the G20 paper, and I think these are numbers, really impressive numbers. And it's important that the Biotech and EuropaBio and your national associations have these numbers at hand. Because if other sectors are talking to the EU, are talking to national governments, to the ministers of finance, to the ministers of economical affairs, they have this data at hand. They try to convince politicians to invest in their sector by using these arguments. Because the 34.5 billion direct GDP contribution is half of the coin. The other half of the coin is that you can add 45 billion to it due to indirect induced effect. That means every created euro within the biotech sector in Europe creates more than 1 euro along the entire supply chain. So in the end, we have a close to 80 billion gross value added, which is related on private and public investments in biotech. Taking the labor market into account, because it's always important to have numbers for growth, for employment, and the trade balance. Here you can see that 224,000 people, they are stimulating 634,000 indirect employees, an additional 300. So we have a multiplier for more than 4. Every job created in the biotech sector in Europe creates more than 4 additional employees along the supply chain within the European labor market. So close to 1.2 million employees are related to the business activities of biotech in Europe. What are my conclusions? We need to characterize sectors. We need to characterize the biotech sector and biomanufacturing. We need to characterize them in a way and in a language political decision makers understand. And this magic square, it's kind of theory, right? But every political decision maker, especially the presidents, the chancellors, the prime ministers in the world, they keep an eye on this. They want to have high GDP growth. They need to have high employment. They want to have at least a balanced trade sheet, and they want to have price stability. And with this results, you now can show how the biotech sector contributes to growth, to employment, and also to the balanced trade aspects. Last but not least, and that's something I presented on last year in the UNGA and also this year in the UNGA, we need to convince political decision makers all over the world that they rethink their political decision making. It must be more evidence-based, and we need to keep an eye on where do we invest, where do we allocate the budgets in a way that we convince them if they invest smart in the middle to long-term run, we can establish a positive feedback loop. And here is an example. Investment in biotech will create more innovation, either on the process side, the system side, or the product side. We can actually calculate and measure how this affects better health of the societies. Better health creates more productivity in unpaid and in paid activities. It maybe reduces labor market shortages, but in the end, in all the countries, better health will lead to greater wealth. Greater wealth creates more fiscal space, and then we can take the fiscal space and partly invest in more innovation again. And this is something we need to consider. We need to choose sectors where we can prove, where we have evidence that we can start with smart investments, this positive feedback loop. I'm really very much looking forward to the ongoing or on the upcoming discussion. Thank you for listening to me and for your attention. And yes, always a pleasure to be here and present this kind of results. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And we've squashed this into a half-hour presentation when in fact we could have spoken about this all day. So I've got a couple of comments and then some questions, and I know we have some questions coming in from the audience as well. So I wanted to make a couple of comments. I was saying the first one is that you mentioned the spillover economic effects, and that's really, really important to assess as well, because people often look at a company that produces a medicine or a food product or something else, but that's only a fraction of the total economic activity linked to that particular product. And it's an easy example to use. You say a medicine, you take your medicine, but involved in that it has complex manufacturing, formulation, clinical trials, specialist transport and storage, specialist facilities. You have dedicated legal teams, investment teams, engineering, IT. Each one of those elements are absolutely essential to making that final biotech product successful and available and affordable, but each one of those things is a separate industry in its own right. And I know that when I started my career a very long time ago in the Cambridge Biotechnology cluster in the UK, we used to survey the companies that were active around the cluster, and 50% of them were drug development companies, but the other 50% were those specialist support things. So when you look at, you know, a region that is booming for biotechnology, you know that 50% of that economic activity is in support of producing the final product. And it's an amazing skills base that you develop up. You know, it's incredibly diverse, because none of those products would be developed if that full access to those different skills was not there. So I think it's something we always lose track of when we say, oh, there's this many thousand biotech companies in Europe. And when you said yourself, for every euro that they generate, another euro is created elsewhere in the system.
And Claire, maybe two comments on this, right? First, I got to know in the past, first of all, kind of positioning a sector in front of politicians, right, or different ministries. Therefore, these numbers are really important. But what you described is also very important for the industry, right? So that they have a broader understanding also in decision-making within companies. Where do we where do we want to locate our next production? Do we need, and so there are a lot of initiatives ongoing concerning impact valuation. That means that you not only take the economic part into account and analyze where are the different suppliers, but in environmental terms, you need to take care of your suppliers. Where does where does the GHG emission occur, scope 1, 2, 3, or wherever, and also in social terms. So we need to think in such a specialized industry like biotech. Yeah, we need to take the entire value chain into account, right? It's really important.
Absolutely, and connectivity and flow of knowledge and materials and people is absolutely critical to that. And that ties quite nicely into one of the questions that we have around, you know, building up skills on the regulatory side. But the second comment I want to make before I ask you some difficult questions is, I'm really happy to see the share of industrial biotech starting to increase as a percentage of total economic activity, because it's a technology that's really now growing its contribution across sectors, you know, and it's so diverse. It's food, materials, it's intermediate, it's manufacturing intermediates for use in other manufacturing processes. And this is really replacing chemicals and materials produced through, I would say, conventional manufacturing. And you're really seeing a transition away from petrochemical derived processes through industrial biotechnology. And I mentioned before, you know, as a consumer, I see it in household chemicals that I pick up and look at, but also as somebody who works in the sector, I also see it throughout the supply chains behind products. So it might be I've bought something that the product itself is not different and has not changed for 10 years, but I now know that the processes behind the production of that product are now substantially different and biological, as opposed to, you know, petrochemically driven. And I think that's a really important thing that we keep needing to reinforce, in that the final product is just the tip of the iceberg. So I have a few questions for you. You've looked at the importance of research and how we've seen an increase in investment into R&D. What's the importance of keeping research flowing into this system? You know, we've got gross value added shows a consistent upward trend for Europe. Why is this so important?
Yeah, I tried to give first answers to it during my presentation, right? Especially such a, I would say, young sector if compared to others or to traditional sectors. There's so much. There are so many opportunities for ongoing research, right? And this will be the future. And we see that the quota of investments in R&D increased over the time in comparison to the gross value added, but they're also contributing to gross value added. But you need to think about who is driving this R&D activities. On the one hand, a certain share of it is public investments in R&D, but also the companies, right? And they will invest in R&D if they see future business success, and future business success is nothing bad. It's a future, right? And so we need, and this is also something we need to explain to political stakeholders, that if you are innovative, you should earn a certain amount of money, right? And so that you can reinvest again as a private company. And so we need private-public partnerships in R&D. That's, I think, key. But we need to discuss how can we allocate even more money, private and public money, in future innovations in the biotech sector. And you mentioned the industrial biotech part, right? I think there's still, it can be kind of a game changer in the future, but a lot needs to be done and a lot needs to be pushed ahead, also R&D, right? And so, yes, and also out of a macroeconomic point of view, there's a reason why the EU says we want to invest 3% of our GDP in R&D, because there is evidence if you are underinvested in R&D, your prosperity will shrink. And so in Germany, I think they have in their coalition paper 3.5%. I don't know about other countries, but there is a certain amount they want to invest, and we all should point out that the biotech sector is part of this R&D sector.
No, I think that's a great point, and I wrote down your point about it. Private investment into R&D is essential. It's a huge part of global R&D. It's not just public R&D. And you said it's important for future business success. You know, they need to be able to see where that R&D can go. And I think in Europe we have traditionally had an excellent R&D base, but previous performance is not a guarantee of future performance. So especially on the private side. And so we're always reminding people to say that you cannot just keep having early stage innovation. It's just got to be able to go somewhere. So it needs to transition from public into private development. And to do that, it has got to have a pathway open to it. So I often use this radio, all dressed up and nowhere to go, if it can't be best for product.
Absolutely, and maybe two, three comments adding to your points. And I see it very critical, actually, right? Because so first of all, your biotech is very specialized, right? And we are facing a lot of supply chain disruption, right? So there is a certain uncertainty on the side of companies, right? Where do they invest? Should they invest in the future? Due to the poly crisis, also the energy crisis, we have other issues, right? Where what's not very positive for Europe as a location to invest in. And you see the competition, the huge competition from abroad. So I think we need a clear strategy paper, maybe, or we should make it even more concrete, Biotech 2050 or something like this in Europe. And how do we get there on 2040? So not only 2030, I think it's really important. And what is the basis for a successful biotech sector in Europe? What do we need for it? Why is it so important? Actually, for private companies, right? They need to have a certain commitment that someone takes care of a good or very good environment in the EU.
That's a great point, and it reminds me about it's good to look beyond short-term deadlines, because we always talk about 2030. It's the next one coming up. But of course, when I started my career, Belgium was just starting its investment into cell-based manufacturing and advanced therapies. That was over 25 years ago, and that has been consistent and maintained investment. And look at where Belgium is now in terms of its response to the pandemic and its ability to manufacture at the scale that it did. That wasn't the result of a 7-year strategy. That was 25 years in the making. So I think it is correct when you talk about let's have a very specific target that is very tangible, but far enough away that enables consistent investment and pathway towards it. So that's a really good point. And I wanted to say, you mentioned global competition. So I'm going to say, how important, where should Europe aiming to be at in terms of its economic footprint in a set number of years? How important is this when you look at other regions of the world? Because this is not just Europe's race, this is a global competition now.
Yes, and that's yeah, in a way, it's a very tough question. I see, and so only some. It's just my perception, right? If I travel to some countries due to some speeches, I see for some sectors, you get welcomed with open arms, right? With less regulation, with other, so it's somehow interesting. I think sometimes it's like, if you have a sector in your country, you don't care about it. But there are other countries who see a huge growth potential of some sectors, innovative sectors, and they give a lot of incentives to convince companies to get there, right? And so that's yeah. But I have not the solution at hand. That would be, but it's just a perception, and we should, and that's the reason why I like such a report so much, right? We need always to give evidence that the politicians did the right things in the past, because that was what we are creating now is what have been decided 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and now we need to find arguments, yeah, to continue such a success story, and therefore you need to point out, here, look here, report on what you achieve, what you're delivering, what is the result of all these good decisions in the past.
I've got one more question for you, and then I'm going to move to some of the great questions that we have in the chat. When you look globally, because you started your presentation looking at it from healthcare from a global perspective, what changes are you seeing in government strategies linked to advanced technologies? I mean, are you seeing changes in government strategies, given your own interest in in being able to connect up? A healthier society is a wealthier society. Are you seeing governments recognize this? Which bits of the world would you draw to attention?
So what I really like is that I see that more and more governments want to have more evidence also on the macroeconomic point of view, right? It's they want to have want to know how high is our R&D footprint, how much do we invest in R&D, what should we do in the future. Then they want to characterize the different sectors and compare them, because in the end, if you have increasing debts all over the world, you have now increasing interest rates, so the budgets won't grow as much, and so we need to think about a minister of finance in any country in the EU. He has to decide where to allocate the budgets, right? And then therefore we need more evidence about the return on investments, and I think this is moving slowly, but especially also concerning health and health investments, with the initiative on the health metrics in the youth semester, right? I think this is really great, and also other countries, Latin American countries, and African countries, they now start to try to get such numbers to take them into or use them to challenge their political decisions. And this is, I think, a very straightforward way.
No, it's great. It's like data. It underpins everything. And in terms of supporting biotechnology, I challenge the assumption that people always refer to it as an emerging technology. It's like, it's not emerged, it's here. We need to show how it operates and the footprint that it leaves. It's not tomorrow's technology, it's today's. And that's a really important thing to reinforce. But I wanted to come to a few of our questions, as I know that you and I could chat about this for much longer. But we've got a few questions in the webinar. One of it was, the first one's on regulation, saying how can we attract people into different careers, such as, you know, bringing expert skills into the regulatory framework. Do you want to comment on that, or it's also something that I can comment
on? Maybe I would think the companies sometimes they are driven by their business in general, right? And sometimes I have the feeling that if they would partner earlier in some topics with the regulators, and not, or if both sides need to show a certain willingness, right? But that there is a more open discussion and a more behind the doors. So I would, as a regulator, I would like to invite the companies to take part in an early stage. But sometimes I don't know if there's a communication in the sectors or different between the different stakeholders is maybe it must be more trustful, and so that it's pointed out that they are all on the same side, right? And I think there are some ways of improvement, I guess.
I think I can add on that as well, in terms of looking earlier into the education system as well, because I think people are still quite conservative. And you go, I'm going to go do a degree in this science. People perceive that they're going to go and work at the bench. But in fact, a very small percentage of jobs in science are actually at the bench. I would say the vast majority of them are spread all around the support ecosystem. I mean, I have a PhD in biochemistry, but I was never employed as a scientist at the bench. But there are thousands of different types of jobs, and I would love to see more flow and sharing and sort of industry liaison with earlier stage education, so that people can see how many different jobs you can have. You don't have to be a bench scientist to study science. You know, it brings a great deal of joy and passion, whether you're at the bench or doing something else. And I think that's also a way to engage people into different roles, like the essential role of the regulatory framework, because science can go nowhere unless it goes through a regulatory framework, which needs just as much skill as the people doing the research in the benches.
Absolutely.
There's another question around saying, could we calculate how much the EU would gain more for biotech if things could be approved earlier? I don't know if that's within the remit of WifOR, but I know for sure that it all comes down to how much it costs. You know, if something takes me 4 years to get to the market instead of 5 years, that's 1 year less of salaries I have to pay, rent I have to pay, with no income. And
you can model it.
The faster you go, the more people are going to go there.
And yes, it's linked in a way to the health metrics we suggest, right? If you introduce a product later into the market, you're losing human capital, right? So and you're losing an economic footprint, maybe, right? And there are several, and I think the point is, this is a very important one. I think the entire sector needs to communicate proactively and not reactively, and point out such topics, not if there's some regulations on the way, but just say, we want to be partner of the solution, not part of the problem, right? And that you are providing solutions, I think, and to offer this very frequently. I think this is an important step.
Yeah, for sure. And I think people often lose sight of the fact that it's global. So you can have very different you could have a similar technology and say, well, where am I going to be able to get this to market first? And it's a very simple question to ask, especially because a lot of money, particularly for smaller companies, comes from private venture capital firms. They're going to look at that and go, I have 10 million euros to spend here. Am I going to make my money back in 5 years, or am I going to make it back in 10 years? And you are always going to take the 5-year to market route. And that may be not in Europe. because Europe is established as being slightly slower to market than other regions. It's trying to make a difference. It's speeding up things through the pharmaceutical legislation, for example, but it still has to be aware that these decisions are not made in isolation. You have to look at what is happening in other parts of the world. We have another question in on the chat as well, saying, could you expand on the relatively high increase in the trade balance of industrial biotech? So it's now 17% of the total. Is that due to a few outlier companies, or does it represent the industry at large?
It represents, I can't answer the question very precise, because we are dealing with macroeconomic data and not with company data, right? But we have seen that there was really a jump in industrial biotech and so I don't know who is it behind it. Is it a large company or what else? But we see there is a certain trend that more and more exports are there, while the imports are not increasing as much.
Which is a good sign for Europe's industry as a whole.
Sure.
As we seek to have more resilient supply chains, it involves being able to have the capacity to make more yourselves. But I would also say, certainly I'm observing behavior in company growth where we're seeing quite a lot of M&A, which we're seeing much more company mergers, where I think quite a lot of companies are now creating critical mass quickly so that they can produce at much higher scales. And I think that's how I want to see the European sector maturing, because you need scale if you're going to be able to be competitive globally. And so I think we will see more changes in industrial sizes and behaviors around industrial biotech linked products.
And that's also a reason what you mentioned. That's also a reason why you have such a high productivity, right? If you can scale up your products, and then the productivity is high.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part of Europe's own decision making in terms of policy and industrial strategy. It's what do we want to be able to scale up here? Some things we cannot be competitive on because there are other regions of the world that are going to get there before us. But it's picking our battles and enabling us to create that critical mass that is competitive at the same time. You are not going to reshore high scale production of low value items unless you really try hard, and you're certainly not going to reshore traditional manufacturing to do that. Europe is going to find its economic pathway through more advanced manufacturing processes because the door is closed on existing manufacturing processes.
Yes, and one other aspect, because I always try to place sectors in all policies, right? If you think now about the labor market, that also high productivity shows that you have very high skilled workers in there, right? You have attractive job descriptions. Yeah, that's also I would say also maybe over average wages and all such things. I think you need to consider, even though we are facing some labor market shortages, so that you have a very attractive setting of employees.
Yeah. So I think that kind of brings us to a natural conclusion to our discussion, even though we could, as we've said before, we could easily continue this all day. So I'm going to ask Dennis, is there anything else you would like to leave the audience with before we wrap up this launch event for Biotech Week?
Yes, I think one very important point is, especially in what I pointed out, now you have described the characteristics of economic impacts of the biotech, right, on biomanufacturing. I think the next step should be, even though that it's negative effects, you should be a first mover, in my opinion, to report environmental effects. You need to learn about the characteristics also in the environmental effects, water consumption, GHG emissions, air pollution, and that's not only for your sector, but also along the supply chain, and also the social aspects. So positive social effects of education and wages, and the negative one that somewhere in the supply chain, there will be some child labor in Bangladesh or wherever, so that you are there are ongoing initiatives on company level, and so this is something that will be the future, that you are able to communicate also in this areas and develop your narratives around it.
I think that's a really important point, and that actually flags up. We're seeing a really significant change in company missions. A lot of our industrial biotech members are obviously, they're all about sustainability, the modernization of sustainable manufacturing. And on the healthcare side, we're seeing companies make big shifts towards their own carbon footprint in terms of within the healthcare pathway. And that's reflected within the Innovative Health Initiative, which is a really big public-private partnership. And that has a huge level of interest. And a lot of our members are moving towards carbon, net zero in Europe. And that's a specific mission of theirs to achieve this. So it's something that we're seeing across the landscape for companies, whether they're producing products for sustainability or whether they are biotech products to be used elsewhere. So I'm going to wrap this webinar up now, and I would like to say a huge thank you to Dennis for his insight and all the hard work from the WifOR Institute to really help us bring the evidence base that we need to take to policymakers and politicians everywhere to say, by investing here now, you create this long-term virtuous circle, particularly in the changing demographics that Europe has, and you've already referred to the sort of labour market shortages and ageing populations. So this is part of EuropaBio's ongoing work to support how biotechnology is a thriving industrial activity. We already see that it plays a very significant economic role within Europe. And what we want to see is that Europe continues to lead and make sure that it's in the race globally for biotechnology being an economic activity, because we want to be leading the market, not buying from the market. So thank you for all of you for attending today. What we will do is we'll share the slides and the recording with you during this week, and we really look forward to seeing you at future Biotech Week events. Don't forget to follow EuropaBio on LinkedIn, because that's where you'll see all of our updates, and we'll be delighted to see you at upcoming activities. So thank you very much, everybody, and thanks once again, Dennis.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Bye, everybody.